Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution, and in particular the Business and Economics Group. My name is Andreas Wasmuht, and I'm the convener of the Business and Economics Group, and I'm here tonight to give a talk for you on the key business lessons from the pandemic. In order to start, I suppose you need to look at the impact that the pandemic has had on businesses over the last 18 months. Now, I will do that, and I will start with five key areas that I want to highlight. But I don't want to talk about the macro aspects of this. I think most of us will know that the international governments over the last 18 months have committed to spending $10 trillion on combating the pandemic. We also know that a lot of countries, including the UK, experienced a drop of double digits in terms of GDP when the pandemic hit. So I don't really want to focus on the macro side of things. What I want to focus on is more business itself and how they have reacted and how they have dealt with the pandemic over the last 18 months. So let's start with that. This slide here is probably going to be quite small for you to see, but it covers four key areas. It is one, trading status, how well businesses are doing. Are they currently trading? Have they ceased trading? And are they permanently closed? The next one is business resilience in terms of cash reserves. How many months cash reserves does a business have? And then finally, financial performance, which is all about has turnover increased or decreased over the period. And then finally, the workforce in terms of how many people have actually working from home, how many people are on furlough, how many people are working remotely. So these are the sort of key dimensions, and this is all being conducted by the Office for National Statistics. It happens on a monthly basis, and what I'm sharing with you is the most recent one. So the first thing to highlight, I suppose, is that at the height of the pandemic, 35% of businesses ceased trading. It's down to only 7% now, thankfully, but permanent closures were stable during the time. However, certain industries such as entertainment, food and services and accommodations were hardest hit with up to 50% closures. The issue, I suppose, is that at the lowest point, only 65% of companies were trading, and in particular, the small businesses have been hardest hit. Because they don't have the same cash reserves, the same kind of resilience built into their operating models. So in terms of business resilience, more than 40% of businesses had less than 3 months cash reserves to actually keep on trading. And this unfortunately has not improved significantly since. So resilience, financial resilience for businesses of all sizes remains a key issue. And when we come to financial performance, the picture is not much better. More than 50% of businesses experienced a fall in turnover. That's currently down to 30%. But what is more important, I suppose, is that an increase in turnover remains in single digits over the last 18 months. So there's more work to be done in terms of actually recovering from the pandemic. And one of the things that we need to be clear about is that the financial and business impacts of the pandemic have not yet been felt fully. We have certainly felt the health crisis, but clearly we have not actually experienced the full consequences on business as the pandemic unfolds and how we can react to it going forward. So the workforce, the fourth one, the workforce is quite interesting actually, because at the height 26% of workers were on partial or full furlough. That's now down to 7%. Now, as you know, in the UK, the furlough scheme will come to an end in just a couple of weeks' time at the end of September. So again, we will need to see what impact that has. But luckily, I think the impact would have been much greater if 26% of the workforce were still on furlough. I think it's probably slightly more manageable with 7% of the workforce. But 26% of the workforce actually made the government the largest employer in the country, employing up to 9 to 10 million people at the height of the pandemic. And some of the 40% of the workforce work from home or remotely, and that's down to 20% now. What is interesting, and I'll come on to that a bit later, is that certain industries, though, are actually changing their business models, and they're now proposing for their workforce to remain either totally remote or at least largely remote. And working at the normal place of work here, the final bullet point, has dropped to about 40%, but has increased again to 67%. So it really depends on the industry that you're in. Now, clearly, if you are in a human-to-human contact industry, such as pubs, restaurants, and such like, and accommodation and hotels, then clearly you will have to return to work. However, other sectors, things like the scientific sector, the technical sector, IT, computers, etc., probably will remain mainly working remotely. So that just gives you the impact from a individual business perspective and the kind of things that they have fed back to the Office of National Statistics. I now want to go and take you through some of the key business lessons. So it's a bit of a spoiler alert, I suppose, for the rest of the talk, but I think it's much better to share with you the 10 key lessons up front and then go through with them to actually grasp all the different aspects that businesses have been considering over the last 18 months, or in some cases should have and haven't. So the first one is the evolution of the dynamic business. And that is really all about actually a business playing a much broader and deeper role in society in general, rather than just focusing internally on its own key performance measures, such as turnover, profit, shareholder value, etc. The second one is crisis management and business continuity, critical, and I think it's been placed in stark relief that a lot of businesses struggled when the pandemic hit, and again a rigorous and an efficient crisis management and business continuity plan is absolutely key, and I will dwell on that for some period of time. The third one is situational decision making. That's quite a key one, because most businesses, when the pandemic hit, found themselves in an unprecedented scenario in terms of how they operated their business. And it wasn't clear in terms of how they could actually react and make relevant and effective decisions in terms of how to deal with the business impact at the time. So I'll spend some time on that. The fourth one is the importance and fragility of supply chains. I think that we saw quite early on during the pandemic with toilet paper gate, when all the supermarkets ran out of toilet paper because of panic buying, and that was probably one of the lesser significant examples of supply chain collapse, and I will dwell a little bit more on the kind of things that really need to be considered going forward. The fifth one is agility and adaptability, in terms of how businesses become more flexible in terms of how they deal with situations like the pandemic. I will then talk about digital and omnichannel, and I think one of the, if there's only one lesson that the pandemic has given business, it seems to be that digital and a multi-channel, omni-channel offer for your customer groups is absolutely essential. It's no longer an optional extra. Unless you have a fully functioning e-commerce enabled web presence, digital presence, you are going to struggle in the future. And then number 7, new ways of working. I think I touched on that very briefly in terms of home working, flexi working, the gig economy, employee-employer relationships, and I will cover that in a bit more detail. Number 8 is the free market illusion, which will draw on the fact that the government in the UK, but also around the world, interrupted the free market to actually help and support businesses to survive. Whether that is multinational businesses such as airlines, for example, in Germany and in the UK, or whether it is actually local businesses. And as we'll see, the UK government has provided, grants and loans and kickback startup loans to businesses to the tune of nearly £100 billion. So again, the free market illusion is something else to look at for the future. I will cover resilience through diversity and diversification. So business resilience is key. And I don't mean resilience just in terms of cash reserves to keep on trading. It's actually resilience in terms of how you deal with a crisis. And then finally, I will touch on and go through some of the key aspects of innovation and creativity, which will highlight how businesses in the future can do things differently. So let's get started with number one, and that is the business revolution, evolution in terms of becoming a more dynamic entity. And the whole principle behind this is, as the headline says, the whole is greater than the sum of its part. And as you can see in the diagram on the left, it actually shows the evolving business actually being concerned not just with its own performance, but the marketplace in general, businesses, other businesses, customers, shareholders, competitors, etc., but also place equal emphasis to the workplace in terms of the values and behaviors that are being proposed within the organization to lead from the front, how employees are actually engaged to participate in the business, and how they have the freedom to make decisions, to address problems within the organization, and also the overall relationships and the environment in which people find themselves, and the ability they have to express their skills and competencies. The community is equally as important. It's actually about participation in the community, providing the kind of infrastructure and investment in the community, which helps at the time of crisis in terms of customer loyalty, customer support, and so on. And then there's clearly the environment, and I will touch on later on in terms of stakeholder management. So there's lots going on here on this slide, and I just want to sort of sum it up in a couple of bullet points. One is that business really is part of an entire ecosystem of other players, other organizations, other institutions, including people who work in the business or outside it. And I think that's the first thing to recognize for businesses. In order to have a sustainable business model going forward, it means that you actually address all four quadrants of this equation. The next one is the United Nations definition, which I think is quite nice, which is a company's delivery of long-term value in financial, social, environmental, and ethical terms. That is how the United Nations sees the sort of rationale for business. And it's very clear that it goes way beyond the financial aspect in terms of shareholder value, profitability, turnover. The next one. Partnerships across the value chains are absolutely critical. And by that I mean partnerships. A lot of the value chains are automated nowadays and actually are, whilst they're highly connected and interacting, they're not based on any established relationship. And the deeper the relationship of your value chain partners are, the more likely you are to actually have a sustainable business, but also a successful business going forward. I think I mentioned this already, but I think it's important to move away from shareholder management, which is only one key stakeholder, to a much more holistic stakeholder management program, where you actually look at all the stakeholders within and outside the business with whom to establish fruitful and productive relationships. That means setting shared goals and objectives to ensure that the overall responsibility across the different players is very clear in terms of long-term needs, having aligned visions and goals, and also aligned resources and capabilities. And then the focus is on commitment and integration into business practices. It's one thing having the desire to become more dynamic as a business. But unless that is actually put into action in terms of the procedures, the processes, the way you manage people in the organization, nothing really will change. And as I said, it needs to require a much more broader focus that shifts from just internal focus of the organization to a much wider ecosystem participation. So that is business evolution or revolution for some businesses in terms of moving from what I would call a mechanistic to a dynamic business. Number two, and I think this obviously is something that hit businesses very hard. For those who didn't have an effective crisis and business continuity management process in place, they were really struggling at the beginning of the pandemic, and to some extent that drove a lot of the business closures early on within the pandemic. So I've split this into three categories. The first one is the sort of pre-crisis stage. And this really here is all about stakeholders and engagement of stakeholders. And it is actually vital to have developed as a business, as a discipline ahead of the crisis, to have crisis scenarios planned out, enacted, and seen what the consequences of the various crises are, so you can test them in a safe environment within the organization and monitor the potential consequences. That means you need to have a business continuity and a contingency plan in place, and business risks are clearly articulated in a risk plan in terms of potential, but also in terms of magnitude and likelihood. And those businesses who have a response plan in place, or had one in place 18 months ago when the crisis hit, were much better placed to actually deal with the sudden drop-off in revenues, the kind of issues in terms of business continuity during lockdown, etc. So basically what I'm saying is you need to have plans in place, because failing to plan, as the old adage goes, is planning to fail. When we get to the actual crisis itself, one of the things here is that we move from stakeholder and engagement to communication and action. And I think that's clear, very, very clear. And I'm not sure that that is something that businesses in general are very good at. Certainly my 25 years of experience as being a business consultant seem to be that seems to be an afterthought, and for some reason it is difficult for some businesses to articulate the nature of the crisis that they're experiencing. And that's why I think a crisis management team needs to be in place to actually assess the potential impacts, which are a prerequisite to be able to communicate this both internally to the stakeholders within the business, the management team, as well as employees, but also externally to the stakeholders in the business and value chain and supply chain partners. So I think that's very critical, moving from engagement to communication and action. And then finally, the review of how the crisis has been handled and integrating learnings from that into the new continuity and contingency plan is key. Now this is where most people, most businesses stop. They stop at the action and don't really take the time significantly to review and change their procedures if they have some, or instigate new procedures if they didn't have them. So the effectiveness of the response needs to be reviewed. New metrics need to be established that should be part of a scorecard that the leadership of the business reviews on an ongoing basis. And integration of scenario planning and crisis management needs to be implemented into day-to-day business processes. Otherwise, it will just be something that will be a piece of paper, a manual somewhere, which will need to be enacted afresh without people really understanding how to move forward. So that's crisis management. The third one is situational decision making. Now this is probably equally as important as crisis management at the very beginning of the crisis. Most businesses respond in the same way to different situations in terms of pre-prescribed action plans, etc. Now, what I'm showing here on this slide is again 4 quadrants and 4 different crisis scenarios. On the top left, you have a complex scenario where none of the causes are necessarily known or understood, but they are dynamic, they change on an ongoing basis, and they cannot be fully planned for. On the bottom side, on the chaotic side, things have no structure whatsoever. Something like the pandemic has hit, there has been no precedent in recent times, there's no template for how to act at all. And then on the top right, you have a complicated scenario, which is basically existing business practices. Something has arisen that is slightly more complicated. It needs to be established what that complication is, and design and control it afterwards. And then what I call the common quadrant at the bottom, it's basically standard business processes. It's about establishing a norm, implementing changes to your existing plans, and keep on repeating the same effective and efficient process. That's where process improvement really lies. But this particular scenario was chaotic. And in a chaotic scenario, which is a crisis where there's imminent danger of some form, you do not, like you would do in a complex scenario, initially explore the different opportunities, the different alternatives, you establish some benchmarks, and then you effect change. In a period of crisis, of chaos, you need to act immediately. You need to take action to protect your business. You then establish norms and processes, how this could be implemented into your business model, and then you effect change. It's a very different way of doing. You need to act first, and unfortunately, in what we've experienced during the pandemic, it was not easy for some of the companies to actually understand the kind of crisis they were facing. And again, in terms of summarizing that, one size does not fit all in terms of decision making. You need to understand the kind of situation you find yourself in. Business as usual, which is the common quadrant at the bottom right-hand corner, is not the usual position that businesses find themselves. They might think so, but actually most of the time they either need to address at least minor changes, in which case they would be in a complicated scenario, or major changes like digital disruption, for example, in which case actually most of the time they spent in a complex environment. So the message for me here is that actually organizations are never really in a business as usual scenario for any period of time. It's a short-term phenomenon, and people need to understand how to deal with complex and chaotic situations differently and make different decisions. Okay, what I think I've covered that. Leading towards one of these segments is not really good enough. You need to be flexible and agile enough to understand how you move from one area, which is business as usual on the bottom right-hand side, to potentially all the way to the top left-hand side of complexity or even chaos. And the most important thing here is the importance of liminality. And liminality is really you having left one situation behind and you're moving to another one, but you haven't really entered that space yet. And that is the place between spaces, between one, let's say, between complexity and chaos, where it is important to take stock, to actually understand that you're moving into a different scenario and adopt a different kind of approach to your decision making. And if businesses have achieved that over the last 18 months, they are much more prepared for future crises. And we'll talk about future crises in a little while. Okay, number 4 is the importance and fragility of supply chains. We've covered some of this. I'm not going to go through the supply chain on the left-hand side here. I mean, it's clear, these are just some aspects of the supply chain. One of the key messages, I suppose, is that increasingly supply chains become disintermediated. There's very few companies who are actually producing, are producers and wholesalers and retailers all the way through. Most of the time, it relies on a network of different partners who actually complete the value chain and the supply chain. And therefore, when part of that supply chain fails, the whole system is in danger of collapsing. So, this applies equally to local and global networks. It doesn't have to be just multinationals. It equally can affect the SME market. The connectivity and interactivity is now at the highest level ever, whether that's at global or at local level. The connectivity across the supply chains is significant, is largely automated, and is driven by efficient and effective procurement and logistics. It is about efficiency, is to ensure that stock levels are managed in the most effective way going forward, because that has cost implications, distribution cost implications, etc. Now, the fragility and the disintermediation that I've just talked about does arise in part because of a overemphasis on efficiency. In the 1980s and in the 1990s, concepts such as Kaizen, process improvement, and just-in-time delivery philosophy came out of Japan initially and then was adopted in the Western world. And the idea is to become more and more efficient in terms of the stock levels that you maintain. And the idea would be that you are more or less you are at 99% efficiency if the products, the suppliers provide new stock into your warehouses literally on the same day as your existing stock is about to run out. Now, my feedback to that is I think that is over-engineering efficiency, because it doesn't actually leave enough flexibility in the whole system. And it is people who have dealt with supply chains more effectively have left some margin in this. And the margin typically is probably the old Pareto rule, 80-20. But I think the drive to more and more efficiency to try to get to high 90s in terms of just-in-time delivery, I think is causing a lot of strain on the whole of the supply chain. Okay, the importance of partnerships I talked about, rather than just having automated supply chains. Real life partnerships are important. The supply and demand management is part of just in time, we've talked about. The distribution channels are key in terms of making sure that they work effectively and efficiently. And the future of supply chains will always be tested. We've had the pandemic, we're still in the pandemic. We don't really understand the full business impacts of the pandemic yet. There will be further losers and losses of businesses as we go through this from the health to the business crisis, and that will affect supply chains. And therefore, having resilience and having a number of different partners that you can rely on is going to be increasingly important for your business. But pandemics are not the only one. We're already experiencing, I think more recently, some issues around Brexit in terms of delivery of products and the supply of products and the availability of products, as well as transport in general, in terms of further customs checks at the borders, but also a number of lorry drivers required in the UK post-Brexit. They could always put some form of stress on supply chains. And then there's the economic crisis that we've seen in 2007 and 2008. That will again be a sort of cyclical, periodic feature that businesses will have to deal with, which significantly will affect supply chains. That was number 4. Number 5 is agility and adaptability. On the left-hand side are basically just some of the sort of key aspects in relation to agility and adaptability. It's not just about governance, it's not just about leadership, it's also about the culture that is evidenced in the business, the kind of business strategy that is being implemented and is being adhered to, and the degree to which people feel empowered to make decisions in the business. Now, agility in business terminology could just be a way of managing projects. And I think that would be a big shame if it was restricted only to that. So agility from a project point of view is that you would undertake scrum teams, you would have people working together in rapid teams, and you would have an agile environment in which you conduct several different mini projects to see which ones come out on top. Now that's one aspect, and that's normally contrasted to something called waterfall, which used to be the existing way of actually dealing with projects. You actually did, you started one project, saw it through to its fruition, and then started the other one. So that's why it's called waterfall, from one project to another. Now what I want to do is actually talk about agility and adaptability for business on a much broader basis. That's because businesses who only try to use a different project management methodology without changing their actual business model itself don't necessarily reap the benefit of having an agile approach. So first of all, the people in the business are critical, and if employees in the business are not empowered to make decisions and instead always have to revert back into what I would call the old hierarchy, in terms of you have to report back to your boss, who reports back to the boss's boss, goes into the management committee, and then up to the board, for it then to trickle back down. That is not an agile business. So the business model needs to adapt to that, to actually relinquish some of the decision making to all parts of the organization, because that's key. And it applies to the entire business model. This is not something that you can just abdicate to people. Not even to delegate. You need to empower people to affect the change that you want on your behalf. And that means that teams are fluid and flexible. They're not organized necessarily just on sort of functional lines like marketing, operations, etc. They come together in sort of dynamic teams, form short-term mini groups to tackle particular problems, and then they move on. The thing is that these happen all the time within the business. They don't just look at one particular project. They're actually running concurrent and simultaneous projects at the same time, just to see which of these projects have potential for the future. That means that the collaboration and cooperation across people is much more pronounced. There's not a divide between functional business units. People come together on cross-functional teams and then disband back to their functional areas until the next project comes around. And that means they're much better at coping with complex and complicated scenarios for which there isn't a clear answer, because they take a project and run with multiple projects at the same time to see what actually unfolds, what actually the opportunities that might emerge from running certain product developments, channel developments, and so on. And the development is all parallel rather than sequential. So lots of things are happening at the same time, which actually takes the speed to market, improves that massively. And as I mentioned, the decision making is diffuse rather than centralized. Before I move on, I think the important thing here is this again is not just about documenting an agile approach, but actually implementing it. As a consultant, I've seen many organizations who have got the manuals and the documentation, but the reality on the ground is very different. So agility and adaptability are another key aspect of a successful business dealing with crises such as the pandemic. Number 6 is, and we've touched on at the introduction, is digital and omnichannel. And it is very clear. I've put that diagram here just to highlight some of the things that make up a omnichannel or multi-channel offer. One of the things that seems to be clear is that digital is no longer an option extra. Digital as another channel within your business is absolutely key. And only having a digital channel has helped people during the pandemic, particularly and only, I suppose, if that was an integrated e-commerce digital presence, ideally across separate devices, not just a computer, but mobile phones, tablets, consoles, etc. The important thing to stress from an omnichannel point of view is that actually operation isn't just about digital and one other channel. It is literally exploring all the different channels that your business either has or should have to reach its customers, whether they be business to business or business to consumer. And these channels apply across of the whole value chain. This means that you need to be aware of how digitally enabled your supply chain partners are or other stakeholders are with whom you interface. Critical. We talked about e-commerce and interactivity as standard rather than as an optional extra. But I do want to spend just a couple of seconds on technology itself. Businesses have a tendency, potentially, not all of them, but some of them, certainly in my experience, the larger the organization is, the keener it is to implement the latest technology in terms, whether it's digital or else, or something else, with the latest technology, the latest tools. But that is only effective if the technology is actually seen as a tool to help you reach a particular business goal. And unless the business goal, the distribution channels, the marketing channels, the service channels are already predetermined or predefined, and we use technology as a solution to those issues, having technology itself is not itself going to be a panacea. In many cases, the technology is not just plug and play. It's not out of the box. It needs to be made bespoke to the needs of the organization. That means there need to be established business processes and thinking in terms of how the customer experience should be improved. So it's important to regard technology as a tool rather than let technology be the lead deciding factor in terms of business investment. I talk about channel diversity creates resilience. The more channels you actually can exercise your business with, the less likely you are going to be in severe danger from things like the pandemic. And I think one of the things that businesses have learned is that to become digitally enabled and be able to transact online has made a big difference to their recoverability and survivability. Integrated value chains with partners, we've talked about that. Market access and digital marketing, I think, is another key opportunity to reach your customers. Social media has played a massive part in terms of the marketing mix during the last 18 months. And I would be very surprised if digital marketing wasn't going to play a much more significant role in business budgets going forward, rather than the traditional media of TV, radio, billboards, etc. Customer relationship management is increasingly important, and that technology is also built into the digital channels, and it needs to be integrated as part of your channel offering. And then finally, artificial intelligence, in terms of actually using artificial intelligence to provide much better and much more relevant and tailored services to your customer base. So that's digital and omnichannel. Different ways of working. So what I wanted to show here is another sort of the results from the latest Office for National Statistics Business Insights and Conditions survey, which is quite interesting because what it actually shows is how businesses are thinking about permanent working for staff remotely. So overall, 18% of businesses intend to use more home working. That is significantly higher in certain industries. So as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, in the scientific, professional, technical, IT, computer, digital space, businesses intend to use home working, remote working much more frequently, up to 45% of the time. And I think that makes a lot of sense. One of my sons works in the technology sector, and he's been working remotely and from home since the pandemic started. And even now, there is now no requirement for him to spend time in the office because he can deal with things more effectively and efficiently remotely. And that is the kind of reasons that most businesses in the survey give. So on the left-hand side, 62% of the businesses feel that it improved staff well-being. They also felt it significantly increased productivity. Not surprisingly, it reduces overheads because if, as a business, you don't need to have some of the head offices, regional offices, local offices, distribution centers, etc., going forward, then that is a significant saving on your bottom line, which is a key potential business benefit for the future. But also, it's quite interesting that businesses also cite far more sort of social and environmental reasons as a benefit in terms of reduced carbon emissions. So obviously, the ubiquitous morning commute has come to an end for people who are working remotely. I mean, as a member of staff, you would be delighted because it could save you, what, an hour and a half to 3 hours commute there and back in London alone, and even more for people who come into London or major cities from further afield. So that's a huge benefit for staff, but also a huge benefit for the planet in terms of carbon emissions and for the business in terms of its productivity. What is also interesting is that actually businesses feel that it gives them a much wider geographical pool from which to resource people. So, for example, and the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution is a good example. It is perfectly capable for me to invite speakers from around the world now, for example, to be on the Zoom screen presenting something from, let's say, Silicon Valley to an audience that are sat in the Elwyn room, but the speaker is in San Diego. So I think that is one of the benefits of remote working and the digital revolution. That enables us to actually have people part of the organization, part of the business from all over the world without necessarily being in a particular office. It also therefore means that there's a better match with skills because there's a wider pool of people with different skill sets, and businesses believe it actually significantly reduces sickness levels as well. So, I think that in certain industries, certainly, there will be a case where what used to be work from home Friday will be turned on its head, and it will probably be come to work Friday and you stay remote for the rest of the week. So it will be quite interesting to see how permanent that kind of change will be across different size businesses. And we've talked about that, the new ways of working. So, number 8, the free market illusion. We covered that to some extent verbally early on, but I wanted to show you some figures here, which are actually quite telling. So, as I said, the free market is definitely not free market. The government involvement and participation in the economy over the last 18 months has been unprecedented. I quoted some figures earlier on at the beginning. The governments of the world have dedicated $10 trillion to combating the pandemic. And that's a huge investment. And it's not just a government investment, it's actually there to support individuals, businesses, health sectors, etc. And in terms of the money that has been spent, So far, and this is only in the 2020 to 21 tax year, the government in the UK has spent 339 billion pounds, and it's going to spend less in the current tax year, but still 200 billion pounds. Now that's the highest on record. The UK government hasn't spent this. This even goes back to before the Spanish flu at the beginning of the 19th century. So this is a huge undertaking for what effectively is a conservative government, which proposes a free market and the invisible hand of the market in terms of supply and demand. And I think, of course, it's been widely welcome by individuals and businesses alike. So on the left-hand side, you see the level of additional public spending, 127 billion, and that is things like the NHS in general, the purchase of vaccines, test and trace, PPE, and the like. Then support for households has been very significant as well, in the region of about 80 billion in the previous tax year. Well, obviously it's continuing, although furlough scheme is going to come to an end in September. So the first chunk there is the 54 billion. That's the furlough scheme. The 20 odd billion above that is the self-employed scheme, and there's another 8 billion pounds of welfare spending on top of that. So that takes it to about 80 billion for households. As far as businesses are concerned, they also have received significant support by the government in the region of about 65-70 billion pounds. That is made up of 31 billion pounds of loans and guarantees. That's not the total of loans and guarantees. This is just the amount of money the government has sort of already set aside as never being repaid by businesses. So that's their current estimate. 31 billion pounds will not be repaid, or won't be able to be repaid, by businesses who've benefited from these loans and guarantees. That's a fair chunk. Then you've got the business rates relief that accounts for another sort of double-digit billion amount, and then you've got various grants and some other amounts there to actually support businesses. And I think that's been instrumental in terms of keeping a lot of these businesses afloat. But as I said earlier, the long-term impact on businesses and the economy is still not clear. Although we're seeing some sort of green shoots of GDP recovery and good positive noises from the IMF, we are definitely not out of the woods yet. And I think the next 12 months are definitely going to be as rocky as the last 18 months have been. So I think businesses who heed the lessons, the 10 key lessons that I'm talking about today, I think will be the ones who will be thriving. Okay. Number 9, we're nearly there, only 2 more to go, and that is resilience through diversity and diversification. Now, as I'm putting the same schematic in terms of the quadrants, slightly different in terms of business, people, marketing, community. But I think the reason why I've put this up is because diversification and diversity apply to all of these. From a business perspective, the top left-hand quadrant, diversification is an important aspect. And that can be vertical diversification, which means as a business you would be going further into the supply chain. You would be doing things that your suppliers would be doing potentially instead of them. So that will get a greater control of the greater amount of the supply chain that your business relies on. Horizontal diversification is obviously expanding, for example, your product range, your channel range, etc., but you're keeping to the kind of business and the kind of products and services that you provide. The other thing about the business is diverse governance and diverse business models. That actually not all part of your business needs to be led in the same way. And we talked about that in terms of agile and flexibility, actually empowering your workforce to actually make decisions on behalf of the business. And that means, as far as people are concerned, much more diverse backgrounds, much more diverse skills, and much more diverse team working, rather than the sort of static and hierarchical structure of functional teams. The community, it's about engagement and involvement. And it is really important that actually the community at large benefits and understands the value that is being created by the business and the services that are being provided. I talked about previously about stakeholder and not shareholder management. It's about partnerships and seeing diversity, different types of skill sets, different kinds of competencies in your business as a strength rather than recruiting in one's own likeness. And an openness for the business to change is equally as important, because by being open to different scenarios and actually understanding the situation the business is currently in will facilitate an emergence of far more opportunities, even from the crisis. It's about seeing the crisis as an opportunity to do things differently, which has helped businesses to go forward with more success. We talked about colleague participation. This is about actually making sure that employees in the business understand the business in terms of the vision for the business, the values, the strategies, the plans, but also even the metrics. Why are certain things really important for financial performance? And as I mentioned countless times during this presentation, and I hope that will resonate, is actually creating and developing lasting human-to-human relationships, whether that's within or outside the organization, is key. And the old adage is, don't have all your eggs in one basket. Do consider horizontal and vertical diversification that I explained at the beginning of this slide. Okay, finally, another 4-quadrant slide, unfortunately, but I think hopefully that will make sense. So this is an innovation and creativity process. It starts off with ideation in the top right-hand corner, and that is about actually imagining new things. Now, and some businesses are quite good at that in terms of thinking more digital, looking at disruptive technologies, looking at their products differently. But what I'm advocating is that they should also include things like looking at your business model on an ongoing basis. Is that still fit for purpose, the way we're organized? Are we making decisions in the right way? Is the structure of the organization right for us? Is the overall governance right for us? Do we need to change that? So it's not just about the sort of nitty-gritty of specific products and processes. It's really the whole way the business operates that's important. And once that ideation has taken place, hopefully through agile teams, cross-functional teams, you then move into the exploration stage, which is all about research. This is still about keeping your options open. This is really doing safe to fail experiments here by doing concurrent multiple projects at the same time to see what works and what doesn't work. And this is what's different. You're looking at providing disruptive opportunities rather than a continuous improvement of the existing processes. So it's all about research, it's all about experiments, and it's about adaptation. Using existing processes for something different rather than what it was currently intended for or used for. I think the famous example is Viagra, which was originally a cardiovascular drug for heart conditions, but certain obviously side effects were noticed, and that spawned a completely new industry. That is basically exaptation, using something designed for one thing for something completely differently. So I think that's hopefully example will help. Once you've done that exploration, you move to the creation. And the creation, again, is still quite in an open and agile format. You're still developing several prototypes. You're looking at different proofs of concept for a variety of projects and for products and services. You run a series of pilots and you start the selection process. But that selection process is still open. Yeah, it's only once you've actually decided which one of these has got the greatest potential, which one is the one that you can bring to market in the most effective and efficient manner, that you then move to the implementation stage. And then clearly it is about marketing, it's about production, it's about distribution. But the key thing here is to the retaining flexible thinking, receptive to new ideas. And you really only crystallize all of those aspects when you get to the implementation phase. So the most important aspects here of innovation are that you think outside the box, you think differently, you explore different things, and you get to a place where you can evaluate simultaneous products and services at the same time against given parameters. The idea is that you're actually doing this in real time. You're not doing this sequentially like in waterfall, and you're testing multiple and simultaneous scenarios. Good. Well, that are the 10 key lessons for businesses. I hope you found that helpful. I just wanted to summarize it at the very end once again. We've talked about the evolution of the dynamic business in terms of thinking much more broadly rather than just the internal key performance measures of the institution itself. Think much more broadly in terms of the employees, in terms of the marketplace, in terms of stakeholders and the community at large. The necessity and importance of having a crisis management and business continuity plan in place that isn't just a manual but has been documented, has been practiced on an ongoing basis and can be enacted as a crisis arises. We've talked about in number 3 about situational decision making, which is all about thinking, understanding the situation and the crisis you find yourself in. What is the nature of that position, and therefore how do you react in a chaotic versus a complex versus a complicated or common business situation. The importance and fragility of supply chains is all about making sure that you have resilience built into your own organization, but you also ensure that your supply partners have built in the same resilience into theirs, and that there is a human-to-human relationship that has been formed which can bridge some of the potential points of crisis. Agility and adaptability is doing different things differently. It's probably the best way of describing it. And the digital and omnichannel offering is one aspect of that. This is quite, used to be seen as a disruptive technology. This really is now a business as usual channel of any business. And the important thing here was that it needs to be integrated into the rest of the channels, but it also needs to be e-commerce and transactionally enabled for it to really be of benefit to organizations going forward. We talked about new ways of working, number 7, which is all about different teams working differently in an agile manner, but also working in a completely different place, working remotely, working from home, coming together at the place of work more rarely, depending on the industry. And I highlighted that, certainly the service, the technical side of things, the scientific community, IT, computers, and the digital economy are definitely heading in that direction to maintain remote and from home working after the pandemic has ceased. We talked about the free market illusion and the fact that governments around the world have intervened in the pandemic and supported businesses, international businesses, local businesses, households, national health services, etc. And we talked about resilience through diversity in the organization and diversification. And then finally, we finished off with innovation and creativity and the process that you follow through to keep your options open, to run concurrent and simultaneous projects, and then choose and implement the ones that seem to be most positive. Well, I hope you found this talk very helpful if you are in business, or interesting at least if you're a layperson, and maybe challenging and controversial if you are an academic in the field. But I would always welcome feedback you can give to me, and my email address is Andreas, Andreas, .Wasmuht, that's WASMUHT, @brlsi.org. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you're interested in other talks that the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution offers, then I suggest you visit the Virtual Brilsey YouTube channel. For now, goodbye, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.